Okay, guys and gals, this is Chapter 11, The Peculiar Institution. In this section, we're going to be talking about the Old South, life under slavery, slave culture, and resistance to slavery. And we're talking about this, remember, during the antebellum period. So this is the time period right up to the beginning of the Civil War. So we're talking 1800, 1840, okay? So this is all leading up to the Civil War, understanding this culture, understanding the culture of the South during this time period is really going to be important to understanding some of the causes of the Civil War. So in this first section, we're going to talk about how slavery affected and shaped the social and economic relationships in the South. Now, by 1820, slavery is definitely an old institution in America. With abolition in the northern states, this peculiar institution of slavery is going to become very unique to the South. By the time the Civil War starts, the slave population has increased to nearly 4 million, and slavery has spread to Arkansas, Louisiana, and eastern Texas. Now, slaves are 1/3 of the South's entire population and half of the population in the cotton states of the Deep South. Now, remember that slavery's expansion was really due to the growth of cotton production, and this has replaced sugar as the world's major slave crop. Now, though slavery continued in Brazil and in the Caribbean, Britain had already abolished slavery within its empire in 1833, and that made the United States slavery center in the Western Hemisphere. The Old South was the largest and most powerful slave society probably in history, and it based on the region's virtual monopoly on cotton. Cotton was used in textile manufacturing, and it made it central to the Industrial Revolution, both in Europe and America, and it was really the most important commodity in international trade. By 1803, cotton was America's most important export, and by 1860, investments in slaves exceeded the value in the worth of all of the nation's factories, railroads, and banks combined. Now, to replace the foreign slave trade that had been banned in the U.S. in 1808, there was a massive internal trade that had developed. More than 2 million slaves were sold between 1820 and 1860, many of whom were transported to the Deep South to new cotton plantations. Virtually every slave owner at some point bought and sold slaves. The Cotton Kingdom could not have developed without this internal slave trade, and older slave states in the East really became dependent on the sale of their slaves. So this is what we would call the Second Middle Passage. This is a photograph of Frederick Douglass. He was the fugitive slave who became a very prominent abolitionist, and this picture was probably taken between 1847 and 1852. So there was a fellow abolitionist who was commenting on his appearance and said the very look and bearing of Douglass are irresistible logic against the oppression of his race. They're talking about how genteel and intelligent and very put together that he looks, and how that's very different than maybe the rest of how everyone is viewing the rest of his race. You can see the slave population as it develops and grows in the United States. Here you see this is an engraving from just after the Civil War called Cotton Pressing in Louisiana. Okay, you can see the slaves working the cotton gin. This is, black laborers are bringing cotton to the machine. It's running through the wheels and it's separating out the cotton from the seed, and that's really what helped the slave industry to expand and the cotton industry to expand as well. Here you see on the map, this is the slave population around 1860. Now, rather than being very evenly distributed throughout the South, you can see that the slave population was concentrated in those areas where soil is the best suited for growing cotton, and you can see where the easiest access to trade markets would be. That's where the slave population and the concentration is going to be more concentrated along those rivers as well. By 1860, the significant percentage of slave population had been transported from the Atlantic coast into the Deep South through that internal slave trade that we were just talking about. Now, although the northern states at this point had abolished slavery, slavery is still going to affect them. One way is through representation in the House and in the Electoral College. Because of the Three-Fifths Compromise in the Constitution, allowing states to count 3 out of every 5 slaves towards their representation in the House, it's going to also give them a greater power when it comes to electing the president through the Electoral College. There was also fugitive slave laws that had been passed that required all of the states to return fugitive slaves to their owners. And slavery is really going to touch the lives of all Americans. Northern merchants and manufacturers participated in the slave economy and profited from it. The cotton trade profits helped to finance the industrial development and the internal improvement that happened in the North. The northern ships are carrying cotton, northern banks are financing the plantations, northern companies are going to insure slave property, and northern factories are turning cotton into clothing. So while slavery defined and dominated the South's economy, the South was a very diverse region. In the Upper South, slave and slave owners were a much smaller percentage of the population as compared to the Deep South states that would stretch from South Carolina to Texas. The Upper South had centers of manufacturing, while the Deep South depended entirely upon cotton. And yet slavery caused the South to have a very different economic development than the North. Slavery did inhibit industrial growth. It discouraged immigration. It slowed technological progress. It did not have large and diverse cities like the North, other than the one exception being New Orleans. Banks and railroad lines served plantations, but very little other areas of the South. And while many in the North thought that slavery prevented economic growth, slavery was in fact very profitable and expanded Southern economy. You can see here, this is a picture of a slave dealer's place of business in Atlanta. The buying and selling of slaves was a very regularized part of the Southern economy, and businesses like this were a very common sight in nearly every Southern town. You can see this is an advertisement by a slave trader who's looking for owners that want to sell their slaves. Dealers like this played a very important role in moving the slaves from the Upper South to the Cotton Kingdom of the Gulf Coast states. You can see here, this is a picture of New Orleans in 1860. You can see the size and the scale of the cotton trade, and this is really the South's largest city. More than 3,500 steamboats arrived in New Orleans in 1860 alone. Now, not all Southern white families owned slaves. Because planters had the best land, most white small farmers lived outside of the plantation belt in areas that would have been unsuitable for growing cotton. They worked the land with the labor of their family members and not slaves or people that were paid a wage workers. Many were self-sufficient and very remote from the markets that the large plantation owners would have been a part of. And they were often desperately poor and more often illiterate than northern farmers were, since most southern states lacked the free public schools that we would start to see in the north. In part because these farmers did not provide a market for manufactured goods, the South did not develop industry as much as the North. While some poor whites resented the planters' economic and political power, most accommodated them and shared with them this common racial identity, business ties, political culture, and family ties as well. Many white small farmers believed that their economic and their personal freedom rested on slavery just as much as it did for the large plantation owners. Most slave owners did not own large plantations. In 1850, most slaveholding families owned 5 or fewer slaves. There was only a small number of families that owned more than 20, and even fewer owned more than 100. Planters' slave property provided wealth, status, and influence. They held the best land, had the highest incomes, and they really dominated local and state politics and government because of this influence. Small slave owners really aspired to become large planters, and planters owned slaves in order to make huge profits, and they used those profits for very conspicuous consumption of luxury goods. They're going to be very flashy, very outgoing with this. They want people to see how much they can own. And in doing so, they're creating kind of this aristocratic social material life that is really going to be at odds with what the life of most northern farmers is like at this time. This, you can see, is an upcountry family dressed in homespun gear. This is in the picture taken in the Cedar Mountains of Virginia. And these white families in the pre-Civil War South are very isolated from the market economy. While this picture was taken in 1861, it really does reflect the way of life for many small white farmers of the time period. This is a picture or a small detail from Norman's chart of the lower Mississippi River. And this is showing the slave plantations laid out so that each had land along the riverfront and therefore had access to the market. You can see each little blue section coming out from the river is a plantation. Now, plantations were part of a world market. It wasn't just in the United States, and the planters really worked to accumulate more land, more slaves, and more profit. Some of those profits they invested back into railroads and banks, but most planters celebrated not this competitive capitalism, but more of a hierarchical agrarian farming society in which slaveholding gentlemen are going to take personal responsibility for the well-being of their dependent women, children, and slaves. This outlook of paternalism, paternal meaning father, had long been a feature of American slavery, but it very much deepened with the end of the African slave trade, which closed the cultural gap between slaves and owners. Most Southern slave owners lived on their own plantations close to their slaves, and so paternalism justified the slavery's brutality. Owners thought of themselves as kind and responsible, even when they are buying, selling, and punishing their slaves. Over time, Southern values split from the North culture of equality, competition, and even individualism. In the South, men of all classes followed this code of personal honor, in which they were expected to defend the reputation of themselves, their families, and to do so with violence if necessary. Dueling was illegal, but it was not uncommon. Southern white women were even more confined to the home and the domestic ideal than Northern women were. In the 30 years before the Civil War, pro-slavery, this thought of pro-slavery came to dominate the Southern intellectual and cultural life. Fewer Southern whites felt, as had many founding fathers, that slavery was a necessary evil, and more started to argue that it was a positive good. In fact, racism, which is the belief that blacks are innately inferior to whites and suited for slavery, really was what framed this pro-slavery argument. Slave owners also found justification for slavery in ancient history and in the Bible. Some Southerners argued that black slavery guaranteed equality for whites by preventing the growth of a white working class in the South, because we have slaves and the whites don't have to do that kind of manual labor or hard work, and so it's helping to keep whites equal to one another. They argued that slavery provided economic autonomy and independence that the North's industrial workers didn't have, and which really formed the basis of the Republic of the United States. Southern slave owners knew of the Haitian revolution that had happened and other slave rebellions and British abolition. Emancipation throughout the Americas strongly shaped debates about slavery and its future in the United States. And while American slave owners argued that emancipation had been a failure, abolitionists disagreed. By 1850, slave systems remained in the Western Hemisphere only in Cuba, Puerto Rico, Brazil, and the United States. You can see in this pre-Civil War engraving, it's depicting the paternalist ideal that we were talking about. The old slave in the foreground is saying, "God bless you, massa, you feed and clothe us, and when you're too old to work, you provide for us." The master replies, "These poor creatures are sacred legacy from my ancestors, and while a dollar is left me, nothing shall be spared to increase their comfort and happiness." You can see in this map the size of slaveholding in 1860. The largest plantations were concentrated in the coastal South Carolina and along the Mississippi River. Those are the darkest areas, and most owned 5 or fewer slaves. This is a picture of the St. John plantation. It's an 1861 painting, and the artist was French, and she had originally come to the United States to hunt buffalo. And this was a Louisiana sugar plantation. You can see the sugar mill seen on the very far right. In this depiction, very romanticized, very idealistic, whites are enjoying themselves on horseback, while slaves appear to have little to do but watch. Now, many white Southerners claimed that they were the true inheritors of the Revolution's legacy, and they freely used the language of liberty to contrast their condition with slavery. They complained that the government interference with their economy threatened to enslave them. Southern state constitutions acknowledged equal rights for free white men, but in the 1830s, some pro-slavery writers began to argue that liberty, equality, and democracy were not necessarily beneficial to the South. South Carolina, in particular, was home to many who argued that freedom and equality are not universal entitlements, even for all whites. When sectionalism intensified after 1830, more Southern writers and politicians came to defend slavery, not as ensuring equality between whites, but as a basis of an organic hierarchical society in which white, large planters ruled over lesser whites and slaves. Now, Virginian George Fitzhugh took this argument to the extreme, and he repudiated Jeffersonian ideals and the idea that America would be a world mission to spread freedom. He argued that slavery, not liberty, was the normal basis of civilization in world history. He argued that slaves are happy and content, and he suggested that white workers in the North and the South should have paternal white owners to care for them, rather than be enslaved by capitalist markets and employers. Now, this next section we're going to be talking about what the legal material constraint on slaves' life and work was. For many slaves, slavery meant incessant toil, harsh punishment, constant fear that their families would be destroyed by sale. Slaves were the legal property of their owners, and they had very few legal rights that are, even the few that they had, were going to be rarely enforced. Slaves could be bought and sold by their owners at will and had no voice in the governments that ruled over them. They could not testify in court against whites, they could not sign contracts, buy property, own firearms, hold meetings apart from whites, or leave a farm or plantation without permission. By the 1830s, it was illegal to teach slaves how to read and write, and although these laws were not always enforced, the entire Southern legal and governmental system was designed to enforce the slave master's control over the slave's body and labor. During the early 19th century, some Southern states passed laws to prevent slave mistreatment, and their material conditions did improve. Many slaves supplemented the food owners provided by raising crops and livestock, gathering and hunting. They had better diets than slaves in the West Indies and Brazil, and paternalism contributed to slaves' material improvements over time. The increasing price of slaves encouraged planters to care for their slaves with basic well-being because it was cheaper to keep a slave healthy than it was to buy a new one. Yet slavery was tightened in this time period. States passed laws making it harder for owners to free their slaves and for slaves to buy their own freedom. You can see these metal shackles from around 1850. You can see these were used as a form of punishment or as a way to prevent escape when slaves were being transported from one place to another. Slavery helped to define the status of free blacks as well. By the Civil War, 500,000 free blacks lived in the United States, the majority of them in the South. Now, while whites defined their freedom by their distance from slavery, free blacks were really not that different than enslaved blacks. In most of the North, free blacks could not vote, had few economic opportunities even. In the South, free blacks could own their own property, could marry, and could not be bought or sold as slaves, but they had virtually no other rights in Southern society. They could not own dogs, they could not own guns, liquor, they could not strike whites, even in self-defense, and they had to carry proof of their free status. In other American slave societies where racial identity was less sharply distinguished, free blacks amassed property and prestige. In the United States, the sharp racial distinction between blacks and whites left very little room for a mixture of races or a mulatto class to emerge. By 1860, very few of the South's free blacks lived in the lower South, and those who did were mostly in the cities. In New Orleans and Charleston, there were large free black communities that existed. Most of these were craftsmen, and so very few became wealthy. They established their own churches, schools. In the upper South, where most of the Southern free blacks lived, they worked mostly for wages as farm labor, and some free blacks here even owned their own slaves. You can see this is the percentage of the total black population, how much of that was free in each state. So if you look, the first column, that's how many free blacks were living in the state, and the percentage of that population is in the second column. You can see the distribution of free blacks. About 500,000 free blacks again in 1860, majority living in the slave states, especially Maryland and Virginia. And you can see here, these are the major crops of the South, cotton being the major agricultural crop of the South and the nation as well. Slaves also are growing rice, sugarcane, tobacco as well. Now, slavery, above all else, was a labor system in which work occupied the entirety of a slave's time, except for brief meals. On large plantations, slaves performed all kinds of work. They worked in the fields, even doing skilled labor like carpentry and engineering and shoemaking. Slaves also worked on steamboats and in mines. They worked in seaports. They worked on the railroads. Local authorities used them to build roads and other facilities, and the federal government even used them to build forts and other public buildings. Professionals such as merchants and lawyers and businessmen all used slaves, and by the Civil War, there were 200,000 slaves working in industries such as the iron, tobacco factories, and in southern cities, slaves were used as unskilled labor and as skilled artisans. A few slaves were entrusted with great responsibilities, such as supervising other slaves, selling goods, or even handling money. Most slaves, probably about 75% of women and 90% of men, worked in the fields. The organization of their work varied depending on the crop and the size of the farm. On small farms, slaves worked alongside their owner. The largest concentration of slaves worked on plantations in the Cotton Belt in gangs that were directed by an overseer and maybe what we would call a slave driver. Overseers tasked with producing large crops were often very brutal. Slaves who worked on sugarcane plantations in southern Louisiana also worked in gangs, really in the harshest kind of working conditions that existed in the South. Slaves who worked on the rice plantations in South Carolina and Georgia engaged in task labor without supervision and had free time for the day if they finished their daily task. Now, from the slave's perspective, slavery in different regions of the South could be worse in some places and better in others. Slaves in the rice fields faced very harsh conditions, but had more independence than other slaves because it was more task-oriented, and there was very much the large absence of a large white population. Skilled urban slave craftsmen really had a lot of autonomy, a lot of self-direction, and could often hire themselves out, and sometimes were even allowed to keep their earnings. Many urban slaves lived by themselves. And by the 1850s, most slave owners began to remove urban slaves to the country because they were fearing that their independence was kind of breaking down the relationship between the slave owner and the slave. Now, slavery was based on force. Slave owners used a variety of methods to maintain order and discipline and to persuade slaves to work productively. They could inflict almost any kind of punishment, and it was rare that a slave was not whipped at some point in his or her life. Even minor infractions invited whipping. Owners used subtler methods as well. They exploited divisions among the slaves, especially between those that worked in the house and in the field. So they tried to divide and conquer, if you will, the slaves and turn them against one another. They created incentives for hard work, such as time off or even cash payments. And the threat of sale was probably the most powerful weapon the owners had, since selling a slave could disrupt families and the slave communities. You see, this is a photograph of a female slave drying cotton on a plantation in South Carolina. Men, women, and children all worked in the fields. In this photograph, you see that slaves are picking cotton under the watchful eye of their overseer. Now, unlike sugarcane, cotton doesn't grow at a very great height, so it allowed the overseer to supervise a large number of slaves at one time. This is a public whipping of slaves in Lexington, Missouri. This is an illustration from an abolitionist magazine, and it was, showing how common whipping was as a form of punishment for slaves. In this next section, we're going to talk about family, gender, and religion, and the values, how they're just creating a very distinct slave culture in the South. Now, slaves really truly never gave up on their hope for freedom or their will to resist total white control over them. They succeeded in creating kind of these semi-independent cultures that centered on the family and church. This enabled them to survive this experience of bondage without abandoning their self-esteem in order to pass on to other generations the values that might conflict with their masters. Slave culture drew on the heritage of Africa. African influence appeared in dance and in music and in forms of religious worship and in slave medicine. The end of the foreign slave trade helped to foster very much this particularly new African American culture that is going to be shaped both by African and American traditions and values. The family being at the center of the slave community, because of the natural increase of the slave population in the United States, there was an equal ratio of male and female slaves, which allowed for the creation of lots of families. Now, while slave marriages were not recognized legally, masters really had to consent to them, and marriages were often significant events on plantations. Most slaves stayed married for life if it wasn't disrupted by sale, and families typically had two parents. And although the sale of male slaves created a higher number of female-headed families than in white families, the threat of being sold and thus disrupting families was, again, the slave owner's greatest weapon. And this fear of being sold was constant in slave life. Many men and children were separated from families by sale, but women were as well. So some masters simply ignored slave families when they were making decisions about selling slaves. This is Kitchen Ball at White Sulphur Springs, Virginia, and it's an 1838 painting by an American artist, Christian Mayer. You can see the domestic slaves are very fashionably dressed. These are the slaves that would have worked in the house. They're celebrating the wedding of a couple, which is dressed in white at the center. Now, in some ways, gender roles for slaves were very different than those in larger society. Slave men and women were equally powerless. So the cult of domesticity, which really regulated women to the home, did not apply as much to slave women. Slave men could not provide for their families, protect their wives from physical or even sexual abuse by owners and overseers, or they couldn't choose when or how their children might work. Now, however, when slaves worked on their own time, traditional gender roles are going to prevail. Slave men are going to work outdoors, women are going to care for the children in the home. The slave family is going to remain central to slave culture, and it allows slaves to transmit their values and traditions and strategies for survival from generation to generation. A very distinct form of Christianity also helped slaves to survive and resist bondage. Slaves participated in religious fervor of the Second Great Awakening. Every plantation seemed to have a slave preacher, often who had very little education but very good skill at speaking and a good knowledge of the Bible. Urban slaves often established their own churches. Now, masters also used Christianity as another means of control and discipline. Some required their slaves to attend sermons that would remind slaves that theft was immoral and that servants should obey their masters. Now, this is a broadside that's advertising the public sale of slaves along with horses, mules, and cattle. This is after the death of their owner. The advertisement notes that the slaves will be sold individually or in groups as best suits the purchaser, an indication that the families are likely going to be broken up. The prices for each slave is based on if they're male or female, their age, their skill. This is Virginian Luxuries. It was originally painted on the back panel of a formal portrait. It shows the two luxuries of a British slave owner, the power to sexually abuse slave women and also the power to whip their slaves and physically punish them. African tradition and Christian beliefs in slave religion was practiced at night or in secret, and sometimes, very rarely though, it opened during the day. These meetings were frequently interactive and very emotional. The biblical story of Exodus, in which God chooses Moses to lead the enslaved Jews of Egypt to the promised land of freedom, was very central to Black Christianity during this time period. Slaves saw themselves as a chosen people whom would one day be delivered from bondage. Christ was the Redeemer who cared for the oppressed. It was very important and central to their beliefs. Other heroes from the Bible included Jonah, who escaped from the whale, David, who bested Goliath, and Daniel, who escaped from the lion's den. And this message of brotherhood and equality of all before the Creator seemed to really go against slavery and its teachings and its culture itself. Slaves rested on the belief that the whole institution of slavery was unjust and they yearned for freedom. Now, despite pro-slavery arguments, slaves believed that they were being deprived of the fruits of their labor by these planters who really did nothing other than live a life of luxury off of their hard work. While most slaves knew it was impossible to directly combat their condition, it didn't prevent them from desiring freedom, and slaves constantly talked and dreamed of liberty, and their actions during and after the Civil War really flowed from this experience of slavery and their hope of escaping it. You can see here this is a Black preacher as portrayed in Harper's Weekly in 1867. Now again, this was engraved after the Civil War, but the scene would be the same as a lot of religious services that took place under slavery. This is a plantation burial. It's a painting from around 1860. The slave preacher is conducting a funeral service while Black men and women and children are watching. The well-dressed white man and woman that are on the far right are presumably the plantation owner and his wife. And this is really kind of an eyewitness depiction of what culture was like under slavery. Now in the next section, this last section, we're going to talk about how slaves resisted during this time period of enslavement. They were very much outnumbered by whites and facing federal, state, and local authorities that were dedicated to preserving the institution of slavery. Slave rebellions were very rare compared to what happened in the Caribbean or Latin America, where slaves were more numerous and often more imported directly from Africa. Slave rebellions in the United States were much smaller and much less frequent. Now, because the rebellions were not very frequent, it does not mean that slaves really just submitted to their condition and kind of gave up. Resistance to slavery took many forms, and from this would range from individual acts of disobedience to the occasional larger uprising. The most common form of slave opposition was day-to-day resistance, or what we would call silent sabotage. So this would be just doing not very good work, breaking tools, abusing farm animals, or simply just disrupting the routine of the day. Slaves would fake an illness or find other ways to avoid reporting to work. Many slaves stole food, but less frequent and more dangerous were assaults against whites, and this would be, arson to poisoning to armed attacks. Escape was a serious threat to slavery's stability, and most slaves who ran away would leave the plantation for a day or two simply just to frustrate owners, but would then eventually return. The smaller number of fugitive slaves who attempted to permanently escape faced very large obstacles to freedom. Often they had little or no knowledge of the geography beyond their own plantation, other than to know that the North meant freedom. Perhaps maybe 1,000 slaves reached the North or even Canada each year, and most of these fugitive slaves escaped from upper South states, where they would more easily reach the North. In the Deep South, fugitive slaves often went to cities where they could just blend in with free black communities. There was a very loose organization of sympathetic black and white abolitionists that organized the Underground Railroad and helped slaves to run away. You can see here, this is a map of slave resistance in the 19th century in the Atlantic world. Instances of slave resistance occurred throughout the entire Western Hemisphere, both at land and at sea. And it shows the location on this map of the major events that happened in the 19th century. You can see on this next slide there's a typical reward for the capture of a runaway slave. Now, in a few cases, large groups of rebellious slaves gained their freedom. The most famous case probably involves the slaves aboard the ship, the Amistad. There was a slave ship off the Cuban coast in 1839. Now, after the slaves ceased control of the ship, they sailed it up the American coast until it was stopped. Now, while President Martin Van Buren wanted to return the slaves to Cuba, abolitionists helped the slaves sue for their freedom. In the Supreme Court, former President John Quincy Adams defended the slaves from the Amistad. He argued that since slaves had been brought from Africa in violation of international treaties that had banned the slave trade, that they should, in fact, be freed. The court agreed with Adams' argument, and most of the freed slaves then emigrated back to Africa. While the Amistad case really had no legal bearing on slaves living in the United States, it may have inspired more revolts on ships in the future. Now, slaves in America very rarely mounted organized rebellions within the United States. The four largest conspiracies in American history happened between 1800 and 1831. The first was Gabriel's Rebellion in 1800, which was then followed by an uprising on sugar plantations in Louisiana in 1811, in which several hundred armed slaves who tried to march through New Orleans were defeated in a very bloody encounter with militia and federal troops. And in 1822, Denmark Vesey, a slave carpenter in Charleston, South Carolina, organized a rebellion. He quoted the Bible and the Declaration of Independence as justifications for armed resistance. Unfortunately, or fortunately, depending on whose side you were on, his plot was discovered before it was implemented, and Vesey and 34 other blacks were executed. Now, the fourth and probably most well-known slave rebellion was by Nat Turner. He was a slave preacher and lived in Virginia, and he believed that God had appointed him to lead a black rebellion. Now, though he chose to launch his uprising on July 4th, it was delayed until August, when he then led a handful of followers from farm to farm, killing white families along the way. And after killing dozens of whites, Turner and his followers were captured and then executed. Now, Nat Turner's rebellion shocked those in the South, and it caused owners throughout the region to punish and execute any slaves that were suspicious of rebellion as well. In the aftermath, Virginia's legislature passed very harsh laws which further restricted slaves and the rights of free blacks. Other southern states followed suit very quickly after that. The rebellion, however, did also inspire a growing movement of abolitionists in the North to further demand the immediate abolition of slavery. This sparked a reaction in the South against abolition and civil liberties that would then intensify sectional hostility between the North and the South.